Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 285. Hindsight is Pew 2020. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are back after our wonderful interview last week with Tema Smith, looking at the study recently conducted by the Pew Research Center that looked at the Jewish community, or I should say in their own language, that looked at Jewish Americans in 2020. That study followed up on a study from 2013 looking at Jewish Americans. And last week with Tema Smith, we looked at some of the ways in which top-line ideas and headlines could be reframed in a more optimistic way than perhaps the Pew study did, or that a lot of the Jewish inside baseball punditry does. And today we wanted to jump in and talk a little bit about how we see some of these things, as well as connecting this recent study by the Pew Research Center to other studies that have come out or that might be coming out soon, etc. Now, the one thing, Lex, that I wanted to note about the Pew Research Center, I think we've mentioned this before, but it's important to note that the Pew Research Center is actually not a Jewish organization. They do a lot of other kinds of studies. They have a whole department that studies religion. And they did get specific funding from a Jewish funder for this study, and there's obviously some additional interest by those who are funding the study to understand the Jewish community maybe in a different way than other studies that the Pew Research Center might do that are not funded by additional funding. I don't know, maybe they get additional funding for everything they do. But on the assumption that they have their own research agenda, there is a little bit of extra maybe in terms of what they're doing for the Jewish community. But this is not a study that is put together by the Jewish communal institutions for better and worse. So I would say that for better is that it's good to get a somewhat unbiased point of view on these questions, because I think a lot of previous Jewish studies tend to be somewhat biased by the interests of Jewish institutions, and we see that less in the Pew study. But there are also other things that the Pew Research Center itself is trying to understand about, for example, religion in America, that sometimes get applied to the Jewish community in ways that maybe some of us think are not quite right, don't fit exactly right. So there are ways in which we should understand both the advantages and the limitations of this study. One thing that I wanted to start by talking about was a little bit how the study hasn't made a tremendous amount of news. The Pew study in 2013 made a fair amount of news specifically for this finding that at that time they had found 22% of Jews were, quote, Jews of no religion. Those are people who, when asked their religion, they answered that they were atheists or none of the above or whatever. And then in other questions, it was determined that they had some kind of Jewish connection. That number has gone up to 27% in this study. But there was no new finding in this study that really created big headlines that I can remember. And to some extent, then I feel like this study is kind of nice additional information to the 2013 study, but it's not really clear to me that it's going to or has moved the needle in the way that the Jewish world is talking about Judaism. What's your sense of that?
I want to flag a number of things. One, and these are all about like the structure of the population study before even going into what it says. And I'm actually not just going to criticize it. I think we've done a little bit of that on the show. There's some things I like in the way that you talked about, it's a benefit in certain ways for this to be done by folks who aren't directly connected to Jewish institutions. Another thing that I really like is specifically what you mentioned. It's Jewish Americans. They don't call it the Jewish community. I know you used that phrasing. Going back way to our first episode or two of this podcast, I really despise how folks use the Jewish community. I'm not saying you are using it that way, Dan, but I think when we talk about things as the Jewish community or the American Jewish community, first off, that is a claim. That is a claim that there is a Jewish community. There is something unified called the Jewish community, like all Jews. And so either that claim is that all however many million Jews in America are part of one thing, such that we would call it a community, or, and this is the shadier claim, which I think is sometimes made, that not all of the Jews of America are part of that. And really the important Jews to talk about are the Jews that are sort of that are doing Jewish community in one way or another. And then people talk about the Jewish community as basically the set of Jewish institutions and people part of those Jewish institutions. And they write off the people that aren't part of those institutions as like sort of Jews in name, but not really doing the thing. And I think that mindset has been among the most catastrophic things to Jewish Americans, to American Jews, to whatever phrasing we want to use to just describe the actual population of people that think of themselves as Jews, or in some cases, like you mentioned, maybe don't quite think of themselves as Jews, but when you ask certain questions, certain ways, do think of themselves as Jews. And the second thing I wanted to name is that big finding you mentioned from 2013. 22% of American Jews are Jews of no religion. It's kind of a fake that got so many headlines. The second you construct a study such that you have as main categories Jews by religion, Jews of no religion, no matter what percentage you come up with, that's a headline. And publications will run with that. If it were, oh my gosh, 1 in 10 American Jews sees themselves as a Jew of no religion, a Jew who doesn't have religion, that would be a headline. It's 22% in 2013. Now it's 27%. Like, that's a fake headline. It's just, the headline is, we decided to ask a set of questions and categorize our answers in a way that will get at the fact that some Jews identify Jewishly in a way that doesn't fit easily with what most people call religion. That's a less punchy sentence, and that's why it's not a headline. But like, I kind of just laugh at all this, oh my gosh, there's so many Jews of no religion. Okay, like, there's Jews who define what they do in ways that is different from how we define religion. That is not news. The word religion ties largely to Christian understandings of what we think of, quote unquote faith traditions, quote unquote belief systems, all these things about stuff you think. And it turns out a lot of Jews do Jewish in a way that is not about what they think. If you ask them what they think, and is the set of things that they think Jewish? Do you think Jewish things? Do you believe Jewish things? Do you believe biblical things? Do you believe, I think a lot of Jews say no. I think I say no. I don't know if my theology is a Jewish theology. I mean, I don't think it's an un-Jewish theology. I do lots of Jewish things. So for me, it's simpler. And that's not a criticism. You have to make a decision when you're constructing a survey about what your sort of core axes are, what your core questions are, what you're looking to get at. Every question you ask is actually a decision. It's not just like a value neutral thing. And so the questions they tend to ask are about what people think, what they hold dear, what they care about. And I think a lot of stuff is more along the lines in Jews' lives, is more about what they do and don't do. But I just want to note that because this is a really great lens at one set of questions, but it's a less great lens on others. Like I did a control F, I did a search. There is literally not a question at all. There's no mention of the word Purim in the entire study, the holiday of Purim. There's no mention of the holiday Shavuot. There's no mention of a bunch of holidays. You'd think that if there were some other study being done, it could have as one of its core questions, which holidays do Jews do and which don't they do? How many Jews are celebrating Shabbat in this way? How many Jews are celebrating Purim? How many Jews are celebrating the high holiday? That could be an entire survey. That's not this survey. And that's not to say this is a bad survey, but I think it forces us to ask if we see this study as the study and its questions as sort of the questions, we're only getting one sense of where we are as Jewish Americans. So what other questions should we be asking to fill in the gaps of this study?
I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. So I think that maybe before this episode is done, it would be an interesting conversation to have, if we were designing a survey of the Jewish community, or if we had the survey of Jewish Americans, I should say, that we dream of, what would the questions be? What are we really trying to find out? In the meantime, though, let's look at the questions that we do have, just to dig a little bit deeper into them. I want to start with that question of Jews of no religion, because I think it's both, again, important and unimportant. The important thing to understand is that the number that they're putting out there, 27% in this survey and 22% in the 2013 survey, that is actually not a number of people who came in and said, hello, I'm a Jew of no religion. That they made up that descriptor based on a way in which their survey was constructed, and then, figuring out who fit into this category that they constructed of Jews of no religion. I've been saying since 2013 that that is a significant undercount of anything that really matters. And this 2020 survey I appreciate because it actually demonstrated that in at least one way that we can see quantitatively. And that is that they had a question that said, how often do you attend synagogue? And 20% of Jewish Americans attend synagogue once a month or more. And 79% of Jewish Americans attend synagogue less often than once a month. Now, what happened to the other 1%? I'm not sure. I guess it was a rounding issue. They then ask the 79% of Jewish Americans who don't attend synagogue once a month or more, why do you not attend synagogue? And 67%, I think, some large number, around 2/3 of that number, so 2/3 of 79%, say that they don't attend synagogue because, quote, I'm not religious. So here we finally have a group of people who are declaring, I am not religious. Like, that is actually a statement that they agreed with on the survey, and that accounts for well over 50% of Jewish Americans. What this tells us is that at the very least, 50+% of people are saying outright that they're not religious. You know, an additional 20% or so of people indicate that they're not too religious. So I kind of suggest that, like, what about a terminology? I think I've said this before in the podcast, like Jews of low religion, and that would be about 80% of American Jews. And that, I think, is starts to become an interesting number where we say, well, another finding that the survey had was this divergence between what they were talking about as the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox. And on all kinds of measures, the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox look very different. That can range on measures from Jewish practice and also political affiliation. So a huge number of Orthodox are Republican, voting, supporting Trump. And a huge number, I think about the same proportions, of non-Orthodox Jewish Americans are Democrats, don't support Trump, et cetera. So there's so many ways in which what we're really seeing here, and again, I think this is something that the Pew study did put out there into the world, and I think it's really worth digging into and thinking about, is that there really is this kind of two Jewish communities emerging, and what do we think about that?
What if there were a survey of all left-handed Americans, not Jewish Americans, all lefties. And I don't mean that politically. I mean literally left-handed people. And you did a survey of them. I think we would have a sense of like, okay, cool. Like we can look at that, and there might, and maybe if we looked at athletics and like, oh, maybe they overperform in certain sports because there's an advantage to being lefty, like in pitching and baseball. Maybe they underperform in certain sports because they don't have equipment that's well made for left-handed people. Maybe like that could actually be interesting. I'm not saying that because it's trivial, but I think we would have an intuitive sense of like, okay, if we're asking political questions, if we're asking like belief-based questions to that group of, however many million left-handed Americans, we don't actually think they're like a coherent group. It's just a disparate group of people that are part of other communities and happen to be left-handed. You could do the same thing with like people who have X birthday of the year. By the way, I bet you there actually are really interesting things that I share with people who were born on November 17th. If you really look, like I bet there's something. That's why people do horoscopes and all that. But like nothing that we would really make a huge claim and structure our universe around. There's a huge way in which this study is that. Like the second you're putting Orthodox Jews and I'm going to say non-Orthodox in broad strokes, but like for purposes of this argument, the second you're putting Orthodox Jews and like devoutly atheist, like Jews who actually are like actively against sort of traditional Jewish law, the second those are in the same group, when you look at all these stats, I mean, yes, so they segment it out and they try to do some of that, but it's a tough picture to really do much with. And I actually desire a world where we recognize the schism that in many ways may have already happened. Like I'm not sure that even today it is the case that I meaningfully share in a deep way enough of myself with ultra-Orthodox Jews that like having a survey about all of us together serves that much. Like I also want surveys that are specifically just Jews who aren't Orthodox. There are a bunch of things that get confounded and complicated when you have people that are so drastically different from one another in the same study. And by the way, we should also have surveys that are just of Orthodox Jews. But I'm making the same statement over and over again, but like it is a claim, it is a choice to group all of these folks together from this vantage point of like, Jewish peoplehood. There's one Jewish people, and so we look at all of them together. That does achieve certain things, especially for institutions that are structured around bringing Jews across those boundaries together. But for people who are really invested in building Judaisms that are specific and of one sort of sub-community, those things are not served as well. The other thing that I wanted to mention on your synagogue point is like, we just get a lot in terms of people's synagogue practices. Even for people who don't go to synagogue, they're asked why they don't go to synagogue. Like that in and of itself, I'm going to use a word that like bothers me because scholars use it all the time, but just it feels like the right word. Like it reifies, it creates a set of categories. It creates an assumption that synagogue is sort of where Judaism lives, because you ask follow-up questions about things that are important, and you just ask sort of one throwaway question for things that are less important. So there's all these questions that I actually loved. They actually asked, do you go to Jewish film festivals? Do you participate in online conversations about Judaism and being Jewish? By the way, 1 in 25 Jews says they often participate in online Jewish community of some sort, or online Jewish conversations as a language. And another 12% say they sometimes do. Like, those questions are great, but they don't follow up with everybody who isn't a part of Jewish Facebook groups and say, why aren't you a member of Jewish Facebook groups? In the way they ask, why don't you go to synagogue? Which reflects an assumption that being part of a Jewish Facebook group is sort of less worth study than the other stuff. So I want the study that's focused on the Jewish Facebook groups, the Jewish digital world. I want the study that looks at, the question, do you watch Jewish TV shows related to Jewish themes? 10% say often, and another 33% say sometimes. So almost half of American Jews, at least sometimes, are watching shows with Jewish themes. They don't follow up and say, Marvelous Mrs. Maisel? Is it Transparent? Is it Broad City? Is it like, and what do those things do? Like, if you don't watch those, why don't you? All of those things matter. And until we really in our bones think that those are Jewish practices, think that those are, like, I would say religion. I know you and I differ about that. But like in the Rachel Gross sense, my deli is my synagogue, that kind of religion. Until we really internalize that, we're not going to be able to ask those questions fully and sincerely and deeply, because we're still really in the back of our mind being like, well, it's kind of about synagogue attendance.
Here's one of the questions that I went specifically in search of in the study because somebody else had quoted it, and I thought, wow, this was interesting on all sorts of levels, which was the way that I think I saw it quoted on Twitter or wherever was that more than twice as many Jewish Americans find spending time with their pets more meaningful than engaging in Jewish activities. Now, that's actually not what the survey says. What the survey says, the way that they put the question about Judaism is your religious faith, and I think this is a huge issue in the construct of the survey, and in how the Pew Research Center understands religion as opposed to how Jews understand Judaism. So I'm not sure what the data really is. So I was really interested in this question of whether people find Judaism meaningful. There's actually a sidebar in the study where they're interviewing rabbis, about how they're doing things differently for the young people these days. There are people quoted like Elisa Klein from One Table, and they talk about Moshe House, and they talk about other things. And they also interview various rabbis, some of whom I hadn't heard of. And one of the rabbis said something like, people are looking for something meaningful, and they're not just going to come to synagogue out of a sense of obligation. So I have to try to give them meaningful experiences, otherwise they won't come. That was more or less the gist of it from a rabbi talking about synagogue. And that seems to be the gist of the question in the Pew study itself, where they say, is your religious faith something meaningful to you? And they're finding that about only about 20% of respondents say that your religious faith is something of great meaning to you, whereas 43% of respondents, these are all Jews, say that spending time with their pets is very meaningful. And it turns out that your religious faith comes out last among 7 options of things in your life that you find meaningful. The others are spending time with family, spending time with friends, arts and literature, being outdoors, and your job or career or education. And to my mind, this is where I go between like prescriptive and descriptive, because descriptively, I'm entirely on board that if we're going to understand Judaism as an identity and as a kind of a peoplehood, and am I part of this or not, then I think we should have this very broad definition. But I feel like part of my life's work is to try to, within the group that is defined by that broad definition, to try to develop a version of Judaism that resonates with the kind of life that those folks want to live, and that ultimately is a source of meaning for them. And it's a source of meaning that I personally would call non-religious, right? That I'm looking to create a meaningful, non-religious Judaism. It doesn't surprise me that people are not experiencing a meaningful, non-religious Judaism in their lives, because I don't think there are a lot of institutions that are presenting that. But how do you survey? How do you judge whether such a product, for example, I mean, this is like marketing research for a startup product, right? How do you figure out whether there would actually be a lot of interest in a product like that? If I could present to you a hugely meaningful but non-religious Judaism, would you be interested in that? I have a feeling that a lot of people say, I'd be willing to give that a try. But I acknowledge, in a way that maybe a lot of the other players in the Jewish world don't acknowledge. Like, I acknowledge that what I'm suggesting right now is a very, very tiny number of people that are fully on board today. What I'm suggesting is that I think that has a lot of growth potential.
So the individual thing about religious faith versus the like time with family, time with friends. I mean, I might be getting some of what you said not fully right, but and time with pets, obviously. First off, I think that whatever headline you're alluding to, like, it probably meant to give this like, oh my gosh, people care more about spending time with their pets than their faith. Like, first off, yeah, are we like, pets matter? Stop trivializing pets like that. Like, this is a really messed up thing that we do. Like, a huge number of people in the world, and I've seen some stuff that suggests this is growing. I don't really know if it's growing or if it's always been this way, but like, people care about their pets. And the fact that other things in my life might be more or less or equally important, that's not saying that if every other thing in my life that I care about less than my wonderful cat named Peeve, my pet Peeve, like, that's not saying all those things are unimportant. So, like, stop with that stupid headline.
By the way, if he's so important to you, I just want to ask why you forgot to feed him this morning.
Yeah, I know. That's bad. I did. That. Yeah, we had a little brief interruption earlier in the recording that folks now get to learn about. But like, that's number one. So that's not really the most important thing. But I think there's other articles that have done that thing of like, oh my gosh, people care more about their pets than they care about this. Yes, pets matter. Next. The other piece with what you're talking about in terms of like, what's so funny about the do you go to synagogue questions? I never know whether to answer the do I go to synagogue questions. Yes, no, sometimes. Because like, I do go to a synagogue every here and there because the like community prayer group I'm a part of takes place at a synagogue, but it's not actually the synagogue's service. So like, I go to that, and then like I also go to like random others. I end up going to services, once a month, a couple times a month somewhere. It's usually not at a synagogue. So like, even those questions, I'm sitting here like, this was constructed with a set of assumptions that are not about my life experience. Like what you said about building non-religious community of non-religious Judaism that speaks to people and is meaningful. I think of that as religious. We don't need to go through that debate again, but like, I know what you mean, like non-God centric, non-liturgy centric Jewish practices. Like, you're right. There's not a lot of spaces that are building that. And honestly, if anything, I think the trend line has been away from that. I think there was a time in the early and mid 20th century where there were a lot of organizations that thought of themselves as secularist, putting aside my issues with that term. Now, I think we've sort of blurred in beautiful ways. And I personally live this all the time. Like, we've blurred things that are sort of cultural in quotes and religious in quotes, but we don't have much, we don't have organizations like, I dream of an alternate universe where we had entire organizations that constructed sort of ritual and text study and community and whatever around Jewish TV shows, around Jewish books. By the way, we do have some of those, and we poo-poo them. We treat them as not that important. We don't center them in these surveys. So the fact that there's a bazillion Jewish book clubs and other book clubs that are made up of Jews that every here and there, a couple times a year, read a book related to Judaism. Like, are those people thinking of what they do as like Jewish life? I doubt it. I think my mom is part of a book club that's like that. There's a bunch of Jews, a bunch of people who aren't Jewish. Every once in a while, they look at a Jewish book together. That matters for whatever Judaism is. We don't get at that through some of these questions. And it's not a criticism of the survey makers. It's not a criticism of the sociologists, because they are asking the questions mostly that people want answered. We need to push ourselves to ask and want asked different questions.
Well, I want to come back to the pets question in a few ways for a minute, because I think it's actually sort of helping me think about this a little bit. Number one, I just want to note, I will say that I adopted a new practice this year, thanks to my rabbi, Reb Mandy Patinkin, who had a video where he feeds his dog twice a day. And while he's feeding the dog, he says a number of prayers or songs. I mean, they're prayers if you believe you're praying. They're songs if you believe you're just singing, but he sings the Shema, and he sings the Misha Berach, Debbie Friedman's tune of Misha Berach, which is a prayer for healing. And he sings the Motzi, the blessing over bread. Up till now, I've just copied what Mandy Patinkin is doing. I have to think about whether I want to change the songs that I'm singing to the dog or in the dog's name. I mean, it depends how you understand this whole business going on. Mandy Patinkin in his video, he actually gives two reasons why he does this. He says, first of all, I feed the dog twice a day, and twice a day feels like a good amount of time to sort of focus on something more transcendent. And he says that I kind of see this as this is the dog's prayer for you, for me, for the world, that somehow he's giving voice to the dog, who all dogs, they really want the best for us, et cetera, right? So it's funny, it's fun, and it's also serious. And I've actually found it to be quite a meaningful practice in all kinds of ways, so much so, by the way, that my family members will say, do you want me to feed the dog or do you want to feed the dog? Because I know you like to sing your songs, And I'm like, no, it's fine if you feed the dog right now. But I think that there's something by attaching a Jewish practice to the caring for my dog, I'm actually elevating the Jewish practice in my experience from being something detached from life to something that is attached to life. And I start to think about you. And again, some people might see that as absolutely trivial because it's a dog, and some people like us who have pets,
screw them.
Yeah,
I've got to say, that's ridiculous.
Right? No, and I'm saying some people like us who have pets. I mean, you unfortunately have a cat, but I have two dogs, and there is something. It's not trivial. It is a dear member of your household, and frankly, in terms of this kind of thing, it is a much more compliant member of my household than my two teenage children, who would roll their eyes if I tried to do something like that when I feed them. And also, what we just said, right? Screw them, the people who don't understand what it is to love a dog or what it is to love a cat, that you and I have opted in to this kind of life, this lifestyle of a pet family. And you would hope that people who have opted in to having pets as members of their family would find great value and meaning in having those pets. So, for example, I would really like to know the percentages from a study that asked how many people who have pets find having the pet to be a really meaningful thing in their life versus just all people. Because, it had in this study, 43% of Jews say that, they find a lot of meaning in spending time with their pets. But how many of the 57% that didn't say that just don't have pets? There's certain things that we can't quite tell there. Now, the relevance of this is that, again, in a way that I fundamentally approve of and also think we should make a little bit more interesting, that I think we can understand Judaism to be both an identity that should have a broad definition, and we should think about that broader definition in certain ways. But I'm also looking for the opt-in element. Maybe you can help me find language for this, but I'm looking for the opt-in segment of Jews that say, I want to opt into a version of Judaism that you and I would argue whether it's religious or not. I'm looking for the thing that I say is not religious, but that you might say is religious, but that fundamentally is a version of a way to be Jewish that is full of meaning, and that's primarily why I do it. That's the kind of Judaism that I'm ultimately most interested in and most wanting to be part of the creation of. And I don't know exactly where that takes us at the end of things. In other words, I want to both, and maybe I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too, right? I both want to have this highly expansive definition of who is a Jew, and I also want to actively advocate for this new way of being a Jew that would, by definition, start off quite small, but that I believe would grow over time.
If I'm hearing you right, you're saying there's two pieces to what we often talk about as Jewish identity or Jewish identification might be better, like Jewishness to go. I'm using lots of words I don't love today. But like you're getting at how, yes, there's a way in which it is an identity. There's a way in which it is correlated with, like, if you're born to a Jewish parent or multiple Jewish parents. But there's also a way in which it's a choice, if I'm hearing you right. Even for the people who are born to Jewish parents, there's a way in which you're sort of advocating for, at a certain point in life, I don't know when you would argue this, but like saying, I am on board with this project of Judaism, but not just sort of Judaism writ large, but like Judaism that is specifically geared towards meaning making in some form and not like obedience to a deity. Or that's what I'm sort of hearing from you.
And not just an identity.
Yeah. Well, when I hear identity, that sort of identity, I feel like traces to things one is as opposed to things one chooses. Now, I've read stuff about identity, and like the first thing that I think any academic article would do is like challenge that duality of what one is and what one does or chooses. But suffice to say, I think that like there is an element of Jewishness, Judaism, whatever, for a lot of people, including me, that it like I feel that I am it. There's also a part where I feel like I have chosen this. Like I could have chosen not to do all of this, and I could every day choose not to do all this. And there are vast troves of Judaism that I do actively not do. I don't even see that I'm like choosing not to. It's more that I'm opting in, like you said, to every Jewish thing I do. All that said, I want to bring the pets thing back because that's where this all started. Like you're constructing Jewish life, Jewish ritual, Jewish practice, whatever, Judaism, I would say, from a starting point of something that isn't on paper Jewish. That's Judaism, right? Like that's the Talmud. Like that's the whole thing is like, oh, we've got stuff we do in our life. You're going to wake up in the morning and you're going to say words related to the fact that you woke up. You're then going to like wash your hands, get the sleep out of your eyes. There's going to be words for that. None of those are Jewish. Like getting sleep out of your eyes is not like an inherently Jewish thing. It's humans do that. And then we put a blessing on it. I can't prove this to anyone, but it feels like the most intuitive, most obvious thing ever that if pets were a common thing 2,000 years ago, we would have a liturgy like Mandy Patinkin now has for feeding your cat. We absolutely would. We have blessings for every single thing that you do in your home. So, okay, we get the pleasure in our time of crafting that liturgy. Do I want it to be like we come up with the liturgy and then it stays that for 1,000 years? No, I actually don't. I want it to constantly be renewing, because one thing I wish happened more in Jewish tradition is that we sort of actively changed the stuff that we inherit. But like in order for that to happen, we have to be able to ascribe holiness to quote unquote non-religious things. That's where you're in my debate becomes important. And we disagree only on semantics. But for me, I don't think people will ever get over the hurdle of like feeding my cat is sacred or special. Like I think it has to be sacred. It can't just be nice or special. It has to be like the level of one's life that is religious. One has to think of it that way in order for it to really become the meaning-making community that you want. Like I think the reason we have so many meaning-making communities that are religious is because in order for them to work and cohere, they have to call themselves religious. They have to think of themselves as religious. You have to quack like a duck in order to be a duck. Getting back to the studies, like in order for us to even ask the questions that I want us to ask, in order for us to get past that child who does not know how to ask point to at least the simple child. In order to get there, we have to start with, what Judaism is not just God and prayer and synagogue and, for some people, Israel. It's feeding your cat.
And maybe that brings us to this other study to bring into conversation with the Pew study, because there was another study that got a lot of headlines. I'd say probably more headlines than the Pew study, that came out a few weeks ago by this organization, which I hadn't heard about before, but it's called the Jewish Electorate Institute.
Noting that for this part, it might be useful to go to our show notes. There's a link to the Jewish Electorate Institute's study with a lot of the different figures that Dan's about to mention.
And so there was a study that came, and it was studying, Jewish political opinions on all sorts of ways. But where the big headlines came out was that there were views on Israel articulated by substantial numbers of American Jews or Jewish Americans that were the kind of thing that got the institutions to freak out, largely because there were around 50% or maybe a little less, maybe a little more in different cases that either agreed with or didn't disagree with certain statements about Israel, including that Israel's treatment of Palestinians is similar to racism in the United States, or Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians, or Israel is an apartheid state. That was the one that got the big headlines. The numbers that actually profoundly agree with those statements is somewhere between 22 and 34%. As many of these things, they're bigger for younger people. But the number that we're not sure were actually quite large as well. They were ranged from 16% to 22%. So if you add the yes and not sure, you kind of get a somewhat close to 50-50 split of the Jewish population that says either that these statements are or may be true, or definitely are not true. And then the reason I bring that up is because in the context of the pet conversation, is that I think that a lot of organizations and a lot of, let's say, orthodoxies tend to want to say you're either doing it the right way or you're a bad Jew, and that they're right, and not that there are a number of different ways to be a good Jew. So just as one example, I have seen a lot of conversation about those numbers where Jewish institutional leaders are saying that people who have these views, for example, that what Israel is doing is similar to racism in the United States, that those people are ignorant, or they don't care about being Jewish, et cetera, et cetera. But my Facebook feed is full of people who I personally know to care a lot about being Jewish, who I know are not ignorant, who are actually much more knowledgeable in terms of Jewish law, right? They include Orthodox rabbis than some of the Jewish institution leaders who are saying things like this. So it's just not so simple to write them off as ignorant or don't care about Judaism. And in fact, I think what we're seeing is a number of different ways to be Jewish, and that's okay.
I'm glad you brought in the other studies. So there's the Israel is an apartheid state numbers. So you mentioned some of them, but I want to reinforce. Overall, in this survey, across all ages, 25% of the people surveyed agree with the statement Israel is an apartheid state. That's really significant. And then in addition to that, like you mentioned, 23%, they don't agree or disagree with the statement Israel is an apartheid state, which means 48% of people polled in this survey do not disagree with the statement Israel is an apartheid state. And 52% do disagree with the statement Israel is an apartheid state. A similar number of people disagree with the statement Israel is an apartheid state and don't disagree. Notice, I'm not saying agree. I'm not saying the same number of people disagree and agree, but I'm saying the same number disagree with that statement and don't disagree, which is either agree or neutral. The idea of consensus on Israel is over. It's over. There is no Jewish consensus about Israel. Every single time that any American Jewish organization, and I include even ones I support, claim that they are sort of speaking on behalf of Jews writ large, when they say whatever about Israel, they're not. There isn't a consensus. That's even more visible now because the numbers are just so astronomical that actively disagree. And let's say it, aren't Zionists, are non-Zionists, even anti-Zionists, some who support boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, whatever. Like everything that Jewish communal institutions have sort of created an agenda around fighting, turns out they're fighting a large number of American Jews today. Now, does that mean they have to stop? It doesn't actually. What it does mean is that if they're going to keep doing that, if they're going to keep fighting against a large number of American Jews on all of these issues related to Israel-Palestine, they can't claim at the same time that they are representative. They've had this decades-long conflation where there's been a treatment of Zionism, pro-Israel, all that stuff, like, has been conflated with, and we represent Jews in this city, Jews in this region, Jews in this country, the United States. That doesn't work anymore. Even playing the game of make-believe that somehow all the Jews who don't agree with that set of approaches are uninterested in Judaism. Like, you can't seriously make that claim when, like you said, there's rabbis out in public over and over in rabbinical students. You know, you had over 100 rabbinical students recently sign onto a letter that said that Israel operates with apartheid. Like, you can't play that game of make-believe anymore. And so this points to all sorts of realignments, reconstructions of Judaism that we need to be doing. And I don't know, I'm not really convinced that the institutions that have been constructed around supporting Israel and simultaneously representing American Jews, I don't know that they're at all positioned to be the ones to do the reconstructing.
Putting these two elements together, the questions about American Jews and their relationship to Israel that we see in the second study, and the ways in which American Jews or Jewish Americans relate to religion from the Pew study. There was an article the other day that you and I both took offense to in the Jerusalem Post, but it was somebody writing about intermarriage and basically saying, you know, it really is a scourge. You know, it really is terrible because, you know, there's a Pew study shows all these signs that people who are intermarrying or they're children of people who intermarried, that they're not participating in the Jewish activities that we like, was basically what it was about. And so what, right? Like that's the part of me that kind of says like, okay, so if this guy wants to define his Judaism in a certain way that involves a certain kind of practices, a certain set of beliefs, a certain set of perspectives on what's kosher and not kosher to say about Israel, et cetera, I kind of feel like he has a right to define his Judaism that way. It's just going to be a very small Judaism. I think it's what you're saying about that the real takeaway here is that the Jewish institutions can't claim to be representing all Jews anymore on probably ever at all, because the things that they really tend to make those claims about tend to be things that Jews actually don't agree about. And so I think that it does raise this question, and maybe this connects to our topic for next week, where we're putting together some of the ideas that come from the literature that we've been examining, you know, the actual novels and whatnot. Like, what would a future world look like that didn't have those claims being made, that didn't have those big organizations claiming to represent all Jews? And on the one hand, it's obvious that there are things that would be positive about that, but I also understand the fear that says, well, what are we supposed to do if there is real anti-Semitism that's a real threat to us, and we can't mobilize because we don't have these umbrella organizations anymore?
Yeah, well, I want to be really clear. I share that last piece around concern with anti-Semitism. From my vantage point, the legacy central institutions that think they're fighting anti-Semitism aren't a lot of the time, and in some cases are actively doing damage and helping anti-Semitism continue, because when you conflate anti-Zionism, when you conflate criticism of Israel, etc., with anti-Semitism, and there's actual anti-Semitism all around us, including some forms of anti-Semitism that are growing and anti-Semitic violence that are growing, and you don't even restructure your organization or your ecosystem of organizations to focus on people storming into synagogues because they oppose immigration and killing Jews. Like when you only on a surface level reconfigure and continue to have entire initiatives, entire marches, entire everything around, you know, a congressperson saying that that Israel is getting too much money from the U.S. because that scares us more than the other forms of anti-Semitism. My opposition to those is not like, oh, I'm not worried about anti-Semitism. It's, I am worried about anti-Semitism, and you're all sitting there. Mm-hmm. You've appointed yourselves the folks who work on this, and you're not even focused on the right stuff. So I want to be clear that I'm not coming from some naive place of no fear.
You're saying the existing system isn't working to do that. So it's not. It wouldn't be a loss. It just wouldn't.
Yeah, the alt world that you're describing, where we don't have those institutions voicing things, from my view, it wouldn't be better because we still wouldn't have things being voiced in the way I want to, but it would be similar. Mm-hmm. And so, but my question, it's funny because like, I actually do want lots of Jewish institutions speaking in lots of voices. I don't want the takeaway to be like, nobody should speak on behalf of Jews. Don't speak on behalf of all of them. Mm-hmm. Understand that your institution, whatever it is, Jewish Community Relations Council, synagogue, JCC, independent minyan, random group of people, like, understand that you're speaking for your constituents. That actually is not a negative thing. That's an empowering thing. Like, wow. We have a responsibility to speak for our constituency of Jews and to make sure that that voice is heard, but to understand that there isn't a Jewish voice. There isn't one Jewish community. There isn't any of that. And somehow we've fallen for this trap where we think that if we don't have one coherent, unified Jewish community, that's going to endanger us through anti-Semitism. I think the converse is just as possible. Mm-hmm. That if we do have one unified Jewish community, that if we pretend there is one and it's irresponsible, that we are endangered.
By trying to have this single voice of the Jewish community, we create a self-fulfilling prophecy where that is true, but it's because a lot of the Jews have left because they didn't want to be part of that. You know, there was this meme that was going around that I sent you, and you said I was not the first person who had sent it to you, but it was kind of like, it specifically had to do with intermarriage, but it was a meme where one person is shooting dead another person, and it says this is how the Jewish institutional world is treating the Jewish future. You know, that by saying that these people are, whether it's because of intermarriage or because of views on Israel or whatever, by defining them out of Judaism, then you're basically killing the future of the Jewish people. And if you insist that the only valid future is what you in the present, sort of speaking in the name of the past, believe is the only legitimate way to be Jewish, and you're going to chop away everything that's not that, you're going to end up with something very small and unhealthy, but you should own up to your role in it.
We got to close this one out. I want to name now that we're going to have another conversation that continues some of these threads about communal population studies, etc. But I want to close with what you mentioned about that article, this rabbi in the Jerusalem Post who said, oh my gosh, intermarriage, like he talked about like, oh, from his perspective, there's this deep correlation between people intermarrying and all this criticism of Israel and all this discarding of Jewish practices and etc. My Facebook feed I'm not going to say has been flooded, but there's been a few people in different spaces whose response to that has been, no. Intermarriage and criticizing Israel, like, that's not related. How dare you? Like, you're saying intermarriage is responsible for all this stuff, and like, people can be intermarried, people can be children of intermarriage, and like, and they can be just the same kind of involved in Jewish life. I understand that it's people who are meaning to be supportive of intermarriage and of diverse Jewish communities. I can't co-sign that response because I do think that being intermarried, I think it does, in fact, have an impact on what people do Jewishly, how they think, what they do. And I think it's good. I'm sick of playing this game of like, oh, intermarriage does nothing to change people. They can be just as involved in Jewish institutions. It's just we have to do more outreach. No, there are, in fact, things about being in an interfaith relationship that clash with norms of how our institutions have been constructed. There are ways in which being in an interfaith relationship, or especially the product of an interfaith relationship, is going to make you likely to think twice about a country that has prioritized Jewish citizens over non-Jewish citizens. It's not ridiculous to say that intermarriage, that being the product of intermarriage, ties to questioning what Israel does. That's good. That is a point for intermarriage. This guy writing this article in the Jerusalem Post, he thinks he's criticizing intermarriage by saying, oh my gosh, it's going to lead to criticism of Israel. Yeah, it is. Israel is in so many ways, through the occupation, through its differentiation between Jewish citizens and non-Jewish citizens and non-citizens, representing a form of Judaism or forms of Judaism that I believe and many Jews believe are antithetical to the world that we want to construct. It is an interest to my vision of the Jewish future to have more loud criticism of Israel. That's good. It's not a sign that things like intermarriage that lead to such criticism are somehow bad. It's a sign that things that lead to that criticism are necessary and good. We got to get out of our defensive posture. It is, in fact, the case that intermarriage changes what Judaism is, and Judaism could use some really profound positive changes and would benefit from new ways and approaches to the world. It's actively a positive to have people adjacent to and embedded in our Jewish ecosystem who aren't themselves Jews. It helps us expand our own consciousness. It helps us build new rituals. It helps us build meaning. It helps us build spirituality. Like, that's the approach. We have to want Judaism to change and recognize that the places that it's happening are often groups that we've marginalized. When I talk to folks from Sfara, one of the first things a lot of them say is it actually isn't the same to study Talmud in our space and to study Talmud in a heteronormative space. They're different. If somebody said, oh my gosh, Talmud study and the ways that we do Talmud study are under threat because they're changing due to queer folks, we'd all say we've done Talmud study in a way that has marginalized vast constituencies of people who are now taking it back. That's good. So we have had a great conversation today. We're going to have more. We're going to close out just by calling for all of you to reach out to us. And especially with this episode, I feel like this is a big one for us. So here are the different ways you can be in touch. First, there are our social media handles, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. All of those are just Judaism Unbound. There's our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we would like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you can send our way. And you can do that on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift at judaismunbound.com/donate. So please be in touch with us. Let us know what you would ask in your dream survey. Let us know what categories you would construct and think through. But with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.